Recently in Africa, Guinea is taking a bold step to keep more of its gold wealth at home. Across the continent, leaders are increasingly focusing on how to finance and build the continent using its own resources. And in Senegal, a political falling out is raising questions about the future of one of West Africa's most promising nations. My name is Joseph Bile and welcome back to Afrecap.
Africa unite, 'cause we're moving right out of Babylon.
The goal here is simple. Every week we'll break down some of the biggest stories happening across the continent. Not just what happened, but the context, the consequences, and have conversations that don't always make it into the headlines. So if you're interested in African politics, culture, economics, and the future of the continent in general, make sure to hit the subscribe button because you're definitely in the right place. Now let's go on to our first story. Across the continent, something is shifting. From energy to finance, African leaders are starting to ask a different question. What happens when we stop waiting for outsiders to build our future?
The curtains have fallen on the 2026 African Development Bank annual meetings in Brazzaville, bringing together thousands of delegates from across Africa and beyond in a renewed push to reshape the continent's development financing landscape.
At the African Development Bank's annual meeting, one of the biggest themes wasn't foreign aid or IMF dependence. Instead, leaders, economists, and policymakers spent much of their time focused on one idea. How can Africa finance more of its own development? Because despite being one of the most resource-rich continents on Earth, Africa still struggles to access the capital needed to build roads, railways, power plants, and other critical infrastructure. And for decades, many countries have relied heavily on external lenders and international financial institutions to fill that gap. But increasingly, African leaders are asking whether there's another way. One of the key themes of this year's meetings was expanding African capital markets, strengthening regional financial institutions, and building new tools that allow African savings and African wealth to finance African development. The idea is simple. If Africa can mobilize more of its own capital, it gains more control over its own development. While those conversations were happening in Congo, similar ideas about breaking dependency were taking place in East Africa. In the past few weeks, reports emerged that Aliko Dangote is exploring plans for a major refinery project in East Africa. And to understand why this is significant, we need to look at what happened in Nigeria. For decades before, they exported crude oil out of the country while exporting back refined fuel, which means they were paying somebody else to do the processing and the oil came back at higher prices. Then came the Dangote refinery, a project designed to process African oil on African soil. Now that same model is being discussed for East Africa. Reports suggest that Kenya and Tanzania are already positioning themselves as potential hosts for a major refinery expansion backed by Aliko Dangote. Still in its early stage, the project is already being viewed as a potential game changer for a region heavily dependent on imported refined fuel. And that's why these two stories are very similar. They're asking the same question. How much of Africa's future can Africa build for itself? Because whether we're talking about banks, refineries, factories, or infrastructure, the conversation is increasingly shifting from extraction to ownership. So what do you think? How close is Africa really to full economic independence? If you're still watching and you're enjoying the video, please leave a like. And if you want to see more videos on African news, culture, and politics, feel free to join the community, subscribe to the channel. I have a bunch of videos and topics coming up, so tap in. For our second story, we're heading to Senegal for a headline that could shape the future of one of Africa's most important political movements. Because just 2 years ago, millions of Senegalese voted for change. Now the very movement that brought that change to power appears to be splitting from within.
After months of tensions, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye on Friday dissolved the government and sacked Sonko, his one-time mentor.
Now for all my non-Senegalese people that need important context, let me give you a quick recap. Back in 2024, after years of political tensions, arrests, protests, and growing frustration with the political establishments, the PASTEF movement finally took power. Diomaye Faye became the president of Senegal, but the true face of the movement was Ousmane Sonko. He was the man that built the political machine that brought PASTEF to power, and perhaps more importantly, the man who was originally expected to run for president himself. After being banned from running, Sonko endorsed his longtime ally Diomaye Faye, effectively handing him the keys to a movement that he had spent years building across the country. Shortly after taking office, reality hit. The new government launched an audit of Senegal's finances, and what they found was alarming. According to the audit, Senegal's debt to GDP ratio was closer to 99% rather than the 75% that had been previously reported. In simpler terms, it was estimated that about $6 to $7 billion had not been properly reflected in the country's finances. The IMF suspended its $1.8 billion support program for Senegal. Credit rating agencies downgraded Senegal's rating, and suddenly the new government was forced to answer a new difficult question: how do we pay the bills? Fast forward to 2026 and these events have now become the catalyst for a political split that most of us were not expecting. Because while both men wanted change, they increasingly seemed to disagree on how to achieve it. Faye's camp on one hand argued that Senegal needed to restore confidence with investors, work with international lenders, and accept some conditions in order to stabilize the country, while Sonko's camp saw it completely differently. His politics from the beginning have always been rooted in economic sovereignty, African self-determination, and reducing external influence over national decisions. After several public appearances in which Sonko appeared to increasingly critique the president, speculation about a split between the two began to grow. Then came the political earthquake. In May, President Faye removed Sonko as Prime Minister and appointed a whole new government.
Senegal's National Assembly has elected ousted Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko as its speaker in a vote boycotted by the opposition. The move comes just 4 days after President Bassirou Diomaye fired Sonko as Prime Minister.
And that's where the story gets really interesting, because while the president controls the executive branch, Parliament controls legislation, which means that the two most powerful figures in the movement now occupy two different centers of power. And that creates a political dynamic that could define Senegal's future for the years to come. If you watch my first video, it should be pretty obvious on which side of this debate I lean more towards. If you haven't, you definitely should after this video go and check that video out. But regardless of where you stand, what's happening in Senegal right now matters for everyone. Because this isn't just a debate about one country. It's a question that many African nations are either dealing with or are going to deal with in the near future. How do you navigate political disagreements and competing visions without destroying the whole movement? For our last story, we're sticking to the theme that we've had all episode of sovereignty. We go over to Guinea, where the president has just taken a decision on gold exports that could answer one of Africa's biggest problems. How do we start to benefit from our own resources?
Guinea has outlawed the export of raw gold in a bid to increase domestic processing of the valuable natural resource. Announcing the ban, President Mamadi Doumbouya said the people of Guinea deserve to see their wealth contribute to their development.
According to the World Gold Council, Guinea is Africa's 6th largest producer of gold. Yet for years, much of that gold has left the country before Guinea has managed to benefit from it. And when you think about it, the logic is pretty simple. If you export the raw materials, somebody else gets the money from processing them. So Guinea's government says it's time to change that. President Mamadi Doumbouya recently announced that the country's first major gold refinery is nearly completed outside of the capital of Conakry, and the facility is expected to process up to 250 tons of gold per year. But Guinea isn't the only country starting to take steps in this direction. Burkina Faso has started to heavily invest in domestic gold refining. Tanzania and Uganda already have restrictions on gold exports, and Ghana has announced plans to phase out raw gold exports by 2030. Across the continent, governments are starting to ask the right question. Why should we continue to export raw resources only to buy back finished products at a higher price? So what do you think? Is this a step in the right direction? Should African countries put more restrictions on exports of resources? Or does this risk discouraging investment and slowing down economic growth? Beyond the gold, what other industries do you think Africa will benefit from blocking exports from?
Africa unite, 'cause we're moving right out of Babylon.
And that's gonna be all for episode 2 of Afrecap. As always, I genuinely want to know what you guys think about these stories. Which of them stood out the most to you? Do you agree with Guinea's decision on blocking gold exports? What is the future of Senegal going to look like? And what industry should Africa continue prioritizing if we're going to be economically sovereign? So let me know down below. I'll be reading the comments, looking for new perspectives, looking for new stories to tell. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time.